Chapter 2. Death of an Avatar. "Please come with us, Rabbi," my cousins begged. Uncle Kumar was taking them to the nearby bay at Monkey Point for a swim. It was always an honor to have a Brahmin in the party, an almost certain assurance of good luck. I was treated like a prince and felt like one. "Not today," I said, shaking my head firmly. I had determined to finish an intricate religious picture I was drawing. "Please," pleaded Sandra and Shanti together. "I can't." No further explanation was needed. Everyone in the household knew that for me, religious duty and devotion came first. I would sit by the hour drawing pictures of my favorite gods, Hanuman, Shiva, Krishna, Ganesha, and others. Already I was a mystic, feeling a oneness with the deities, willing to sacrifice going to the beach for a swim or playing in the yard and nearby fields with friends, choosing instead to devote myself to making my gods. Coloring them lavishly, I would hang them on the walls in my room to keep them close to me, worshipping them, determined to devote my life to Hinduism, which my mother had taught me was the oldest and greatest and only true religion. Mother, who always took me when she went to care for my father, he was now living with his half-sister, Mohane, had gone off to see him without me. It had been a disappointment, putting me in a brooding mood. Contemplation of the gods I had drawn, however, cheered Dime. With small brown fingers clutching the crayons, I carefully colored my drawing of Vishnu. How pleased Mother would be on her return to see the four-handed Narayana lying on the coils of Ananta the serpent, attended by Lakshmi and Brahma, the latter sighting on a lotus issuing from Vishnu's navel, all riding on a tortoise floating on the primal sea. Adding a touch here, erasing a smudge there, satisfied with my work, I was chanting softly, "Om Shiva, Om Shiva, Om Shiva," when I heard my mother's familiar footsteps hurrying up the outside stairway. The door to the kitchen burst open, immediately followed by the babble of excited voices. I started from the room, but was Saint Zero peeped in the doorway by what I heard. "He's dead! Chandraban's dead!" I stood rooted to the spot. Everyone began talking at once, and I missed the next few words. "I had a bad feeling when I got up this morning." My mother's voice was heavy with grief, but clear and strong. I hurried right there. Just as I arrived, the nurse began to cut his hair. The doctor had ordered it. "But why was he in a hospital?" my Aunt Ravati demanded. "He wasn't ill, was he?" This was Vishnu's doing. Chandraban looked like always, strong and serene within himself. There was a long pause, then Mother recovered her voice and continued. "They cut his hair. The doctor said it was too long to keep sanitary in the hospital, and when they cut it, he fell backward. I ran to him. We tried to give him some water, but the doctor said he was dead. Can you believe it? Like that!" I ran to my bed, fell across it, and buried my face in a pillow, trying to muffle the gasps and wails that heaved my chest and burst from my throat. I felt that I had lost everything. Though I had scarcely known him as my father, he had been my inspiration, a god, an avatar, and now he was dead. I had known it was coming. Felt it inside of me when Gosine had talked about the wedding again that day. Now it had happened, and I would never hear him speak. There were so many questions I had wanted to ask, so much he must have known that I had hoped one day to learn from his lips. Most of all, I had wanted to hear him call my name, tell me I was his son. Now that dream was dashed forever. From sheer exhaustion, my sobs subsided at last. I lay quietly for a long time, trying without much success to comprehend Krishna's words to Arjuna as he sent him into battle. I had heard these words so often that I knew them by heart. "The wise grieve neither for the living nor for the dead, nor verily shall we ever cease to be. Head-dweller in the body passeth on to another body. The steadfast one grieveth not thereat." With the slow, erratic footsteps off a man-car rying a heavy burden, my Uncle Kumar came into the room to announce my father's death, not realizing that I already knew. My mother was too overwrought to tell me. He thought that I bore the news bravely, unaware that I was already too wearied with sorrow to show it outwardly any longer. My father's sudden and mysterious death was, of course, a great shock not only to the family but to all who knew him. The doctors could find no medical explanation. He had been in perfect health. Had he achieved self-realization and his spirit taken flight, escaping the wheel of reincarnation? I wanted to believe it, but some thought that the spirits had taken his life for breaking his vows. That seemed unfair to me. It had not been his doing, but that of others. of Vishnu who had sent him to the hospital, and of the doctors who were not Hindus and had no knowledge of the power of the occult forces or of the vow of the brahmacharya. My father had been sincerely following Krishna's instructions in the Bha, Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu should have known, he who had been raised in a Hindu family and taught well. But he had thought that the life of a yogi was a farce, that the gods and the spirit powers were only the product of the pundit's imagination, and some clever tricks. I would not make the same mistake. My faith in Hinduism would never waver. We had all learned not to despise what we could not understand, but it had been a costly lesson. When we arrived at Fuwa Mohani's house, my eyes carefully avoided the rough wooden casket perched on a ble in the living room. In the presence of death, every ritual must be closely observed, and no fire could be lit in that house. No food cooked while the deceased rested there before moving on in his journey to other worlds. While the pundit led a long puja, friends and relatives wailed, and Fuwa, my father's most ardent disciple, outdid all the rest in the fervor of her grief. I cowered beside my mother, shrunk within myself in childish defense against my role as one of the CEN, tral figures in a drama beyond my comprehension. After the ceremony, a kindly neighbor took me gently from my mother's side and led me to the coffin. "There is your father," she said, as though I didn't know. How I shrank from being reminded. Oddly, this god, this avatar, that I had so often stood before and stared at with such intense longing, seemed no more remote in death. The expression was almost the same, but the face was so very pale. Brahmins, who are descended from the early Aryans, are generally of lighter skin than other Indian castes, and my father had been exceptionally light even for a Brahmin. Now he looked as white as an Englishman, and the closed eyelids were like wax. I turned away and pulled free from her hand. The funeral procession was a long one, for my father had been greatly beloved and revered by religious Hindus for miles around. Cars and bicycles and ox carts carrying mourners were strung out along the narrow road leading to the coast, just 2 miles to the west. I was too bewildered and frightened to ask Mother why we weren't going to the cemetery where Nana had been buried so recently. Why were we heading toward Monkey Point, where we always went swimming? The question only added to the feeling of mystery surrounding my father's death, but I kept it inside me and gripped my mother's hand more tightly. Carefully avoiding the coffin sitting askew in the funeral coach ahead, I fixed my attention instead upon the tall sugar cane on either side of the narrow road, watching it slip slowly by, motionless and solemn, the long green leaves Dr. 00 ping as though in sadness. That was as it should be, since all things in the universe, human, animal, inanimate, had a common being. It seemed to me that the whole of nature mourned the passing of the Avatar. When would another such divine manifestation appear in human form? Even the pundits, those Brahmins of great understanding, didn't know. Hanging heavy and hot, the air seemed oppressively still for a land usually swept by the ceaseless current of trade winds. Ahead on the horizon, beyond the Gulf of Paria, I could see dark clouds hovering over the familiar Dragon's Mouth, where the northern tip of my native Trinidad jutted west, straining to touch the nearby Venezuelan coast. How often I had run and skipped down this familiar narrow lane, laughing with cousins and young friends on our way to a swim, my temples throbbing with the warmth of life, exult, Indian youthful joy, feeling a part of each familiar landmark along the way. Now I felt a frightening numbness inside and a bewildering separation from the workers who looked up curiously from the cane fields as the long procession slowly passed. They were part of another world to which I had once belonged. Leaving the cane fields behind, the procession followed the road across the wide mangrove swamp running up and down the western side of the island. We parked on the gravel-led fill that stood just above the lapping waters of the small bay, which was protected from storms by a low concrete retaining wall. On holidays and after school, the larger boys would jump from the wall into the shallow water and swim out from shore. I was too small for that yet, and would splash with my young friends behind the parking area in a shallow pool near the mangroves. How unreal the happy memories associated with this familiar and beloved place seemed now. I shivered as we stepped from the car, in spite of the hot sun. The plain board coffin was pulled from the hearse and carried toward the edge of my swimming hole. Fuwa's pundit led the way, chanting in Sanskrit the Vedic mantra for driving away evil spirits. Following close behind the coffin, holding tightly to my mother's hand, I noticed for the first time a great pile of firewood neatly stacked on the gravel beside the small pool. The familiar mourner's wail once again filled the air, rising and falling in a chilling cadence. I watched in horror as my father's stiff body was lifted from the coffin and placed on the pile of logs. More firewood was quickly stacked around him until only his face remained visible, staring sightless at the sky. With sandalwood paste, the pundit carefully made the last caste mark on the exposed forehead. Could it be? Ritual burnings were a common sight in India along the Ganges at Benares and other cremation ghats, but I had never witnessed the practice among the Hindus in Trinidad. The thought of my father's body being given as a sacrifice to Agni, the god of fire, added a new dimension of mystery to the bewilderment and deep sense of loss that already overwhelmed me. Rice was being prepared nearby to be offered to the deceased. The priest continued to rid the area of evil spirits, considered a necessary precaution before the fire god would release the spirit from the body and escort it to regions beyond. I stared with unseeing eyes at the methodical ritual being enacted before me. "Come, Rabbi!" It was the pundit's voice reminding me that I had a part to play too. Preoccupied with grief and fright, I had scarcely heard the mantras and had not seen the pundit approach me with the sacred flame burning on a large brass plate balanced on one palm. With the other hand, he reached out and took one of mine. I glanced apprehensively at my mother. She nodded and patted me on the shoulder. Bending low, she whispered in my ear, "It's your duty. Do it bravely." My eyes avoided my father's face as the pundit drew me over to the cremation pyre. 3 times he led me around the corpse, reciting for me in Sanskrit the appropriate prayer because I was so young. I apply fire to all limbs of this person, who, willingly or unwillingly, may have committed lapses and is now under the clutches of death. May he attain to shining regions. Now I could see the camphor cubes placed strategically here and there among the logs. Their pungent odor filled my nostrils. A tall, turbaned man in a dhoti began to sprinkle the ghee and kerosene over the logs and body. Following the pundit's instructions mechanically, I lit a brand in the sacred fire he held, then touched it to the nearest camphor. The flame sputtered, then grew and crept swiftly along the streaks of kerosene from one camphor cube to another. Fiery phantoms of red and yellow were soon dancing their ritual around the body. I stood there dazed as the flames leaped higher, until the pundit pulled me away. Frantically, I searched that sea of faces surrounding the flames and tried to choke back the sobs. Mother was nowhere to be seen. It was impossible to suppress the anguish I felt. Out it gushed in childish duplication of the wailing sounds all around me. I was half hysterical when at last I saw her standing near the burning body, so close that she seemed almost a part of the fire, her white silk sari silhouetted against the leaping orange flames. I had heard of widows throwing themselves on the pyre. Was I going to lose my mother as well as my father? "Mommy!" I screamed. "Mommy!" If she heard me above the roar of sparks and fire and the deafening din of mourning, she made no indication. Motion, lest she stood on the very edge of the inferno, her hands outstretched, worshipping the burning body and Agni, the all-consuming fire god. Bowing low, she threw offerings of the freshly cooked rice into the fire, then retreated from the unbearable heat and came to stand beside me. Head erect, she did not join in the mournful wailing. A true Hindu, she found strength to follow the teaching of Krishna. She would mourn neither the living nor the dead. Not once did she cry out during the hours we stood watching the dying flames. I sensed only that she was chanting her mantras quietly but earnestly as I clung to her. We kept our vigil until sunset. Then 7 chips of wood were thrown into the embers, and the whole company of mourners marched round and round, pouring offerings of wa taranthacols. At last the ashes were cool enough for the pundit to gather some of my father's bodily remains for mother to carry to India to sprinkle on the sacred waters of the Ganges. How and when that would happen, I didn't know. I was already too bewildered and grief-stricken to give it any thought that night. I had known an avatar, one of the gods in human form, and now he was gone. He had come to show men the path to follow, the path of true yoga that yokes one with Brahman. I would not forget his example. I could not. His mantle had fallen on me, and I would follow in his footsteps.